When they were planning the Fate of the Jedi series, they originally called the project Star Wars Odyssey. So we can guess then that Fate of the Jedi will incorporate some stuff from the epic poem that is attributed to Homer. And I'll try to point out those little nods to the original story along the way. But if you don't remember what really happened in the Odyssey, here's a very brief summary. After 10 long years of war in the Iliad, the Trojan War is finally done, and Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, is really keen to return home to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. Unfortunately, things don't go so well for Odysseus, and it takes him an additional 10 years before he's finally able to return home. Suffice to say that his men are difficult to control, he ticks off the god Poseidon, and he spends far too much time with random women than he should. We'll have to wait and see, though, if Luke and Ben's journey parallels that at all. Fate of the Jedi Outcast by Aaron Allston ultimately made it to number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list for the week of April 12th, 2009. So moving into Fate of the Jedi, like I said with Millennium Falcon, I'm in unknown territory here. I never read this series at all. I'm trying to avoid spoilers as much as I can because I know a little bit about what happens, but as with Legacy of the Force, I want to be surprised here. So, a brief summary of Outcast this time. 2 years after the devastating civil war that ensued in the Legacy of the Force series, the Galactic Alliance is still in crisis. When Chief of State Daala orders the arrest of Luke Skywalker to charge him with responsibility for Jacen's downfall and subsequent terror-filled reign as Darth Caedus, Luke negotiates his freedom in exchange for a 10-year exile from the Jedi Order. Setting out with his teenage son Ben, Luke hopes to figure out how Jacen fell to the dark side and why. But as tensions between the Galactic Alliance leadership and the Jedi continue to boil to a head, the Jedi Order itself will face something they have never dealt with before: multiple young Jedi succumbing to madness. So Outcast, at least in paperback form, is about 350 pages long, and I would describe the first 100 pages as being setup. That setup is everything we need to get through to get Luke and Ben leaving for their exile as they travel the galaxy and try to figure out what and where Jacen visited in his 5-year journey after the end of the Yuzin invasion when he learned a bunch of Force skills. So in the first 100 pages, we have Luke arrested on the order of Chief of State Daala because he bears responsibility for Jacen's fall and Jacen's subsequent everything. And a young Jedi Knight, Valen Horn, the son of Corran Horde, suddenly succumbs to this, psychotic break. He thinks that his family are all imposters, and he goes on this rampage through Coruscant until he's finally captured. And of course, that doesn't help the situation between the Galactic Alliance and the Jedi at all. And in negotiating with Daala, Luke basically admits that, yeah, he's at fault here. He should have seen this coming. He should have been able to stop Jacen sooner. Once Luke and Ben depart on their 10-year exile, which if they can figure out why and how, etc., Jacen fell to the dark side, their 10-year exile will be shortened and they can come back. The plot then splits into 3 subplots. We have Luke and Ben heading to the Keldor homeworld of Doran to, learn some skills from the sages there, but also ultimately help them out with their own problem. We have Han and Leia and Alana jetting off to Kessel because Tendra and Lando have contacted them that there's these strange earthquakes happening, and it looks like Lando's mining business is in danger. And finally, in the 3rd subplot, the Galactic Alliance rules that Valen Horn should be frozen in carbonite because he can't stand trial, and the Jedi become aware of the presence on Coruscant of another young Jedi who seems to have devolved into madness, Seth Hallen. And so Jaina and her team, which consists of Jag, Winter, Tahiri Veila, and Mirix Tarek, try to capture Seth so they can bring him back to the Jedi Temple and hopefully learn about what's causing this disorder that's going on. So first, let's talk about Daala. When we saw Daala in the second to last book of the Legacy of the Force series, Revelation, she had this conversation with Boba Fett where she said she really doesn't like the Jedi. She thinks they have too much power. They need to be dealt with. Here in Outcast, it's a little bit more nuanced. I don't think Daala outright hates the Jedi. And in fact, she has some very valid points that she brings up in her conversation with Luke, which is that the Jedi are basically running around with no constraints, that they'll go into a crime scene, and then instead of staying and waiting and giving the law enforcement people, a breakdown of what happened, they just jet off. And so while they are helping the galaxy, they're just a little bit too footloose for her sake. And she feels like there needs to be more accountability with what the Jedi are doing and how they're being deployed. And while a lot of what she says sort of rubs Luke the wrong way, he can accept that sometimes Jedi just do their own thing and they're not really good at taking orders or working within the constraints of the law. And that's something that they maybe should improve. And Luke really doesn't want to go on this trial, this very public trial in front of everyone, especially as he does accept some guilt and some responsibility for what happened with Jacen. I definitely got the sense in the Legacy of the Force books that, Luke should have intervened sooner, but there's 9 books here, so they're dragging it out, and it's, I don't want to say nice, but it's interesting to see that there are now consequences for those delayed actions that I complained about in the previous series. So Luke talks to Daala, and what they decide on is he will be exiled for 10 years. He can't go to Coruscant. He can't involve himself with the Jedi Order. He's stepping down as Grand Master, and Kenneth Hamner is going to be Grand Master in his place. And even though Ben is not exiled, he wants to travel with his dad. So the two of them set off together in Mara's old ship, the Jade Shadow. They want to try to retrace Jacen's Force pilgrimage that he did for 5 years after the end of the New Jedi Order series. And so first they head to Doran, which is the homeworld of the Kel Dor, which, as we know, there was a prominent member of the Jedi Council from the prequel eras who was Kel Dor. It's a planet that's not amenable to humans, so they have to wear breath masks all the time, and they end up talking to the Baron Doe sages. And Luke wants to learn what Jacen learn Jacen's skills. Particularly because Valen Horn, the Jedi Knight who went mad, was able to mess with his brain scan in a similar way that Jacen did, but they don't think Valen ever learned those skills from Jacen. Of course, while they're on Doran, they end up finding out that there's something going on with the Kel Dor sages there, that some of them die, but they don't really die. They just go to the secret bunker because their leader doesn't want their knowledge to die out, as they had sensed happening during Order 66. So while Luke does learn some useful skills that he'll be able to utilize going forward, it's more about getting the sages to realize that in being dead, they're not learning anything, they're not growing, that this isn't great for their order, and they need to stop that. And it was okay. Definitely Luke and Ben's plotline here felt like first book, setup. We're getting them started on their journey, and obviously they're not going to learn anything too important in book 1. So I wasn't always entirely engaged with what was going on with them, but I do enjoy the fact that Luke and Ben are starting to reconnect here, that they're trying to grow that relationship as father and son that had really fallen apart in the previous series. And I think they have some, like, nice interactions, even if their plotline as a whole wasn't particularly interesting to me. Leia's not too fond about the constraints that Daala has imposed on the Jedi Order, basically that each Jedi has to be followed around by an observer. Leia doesn't want that, so when Lando calls and says something's going on in Kessel, she and Han are like, great, we'll be right there. Somewhat similarly to Luke and Ben's plotline, I wasn't really sure what the point of this was. There's all these earthquakes happening on Kessel. Lando's mining business looks doomed. He doesn't want that to happen. They've evacuated the people off Kessel, but please, can Han and Leia, go down into the tunnels and figure out what's going on. And they find out that, like, there's old tech, like really old tech, and that the life forms that live on Kessel are almost like setting off these explosions that are destroying these observation sites, that's the source of the earthquakes that's threatening basically Kessel itself. At the same time that Alana senses an evil presence out in space and it scares her, that's pretty much it. And so Han and Leia are like, hey, maybe if we detonate the things one at a time, it will stop the earthquakes and your business will be okay. So, like, Lando calls in a bunch of old acquaintances. We've got Wedge, we've got Kel Tainer, we've got Nawara Ven, who was Luke's lawyer, his wife, Rysati. We've got Merrick Steele, who was from, I think, the TIE Fighter games, like a whole bunch of cameo appearances. Although Wedge is really the only at all fleshed out character here. And they're able to detonate the things and save the day, and Lando's business is okay, and Han and Leia are gonna come back to Coruscant. I had forgotten that Lando owned Kessel. I think it goes all the way back to Champions of the Force and the end of the Jedi Academy trilogy, so I guess it was good to be reminded of that, but it did feel somewhat like, okay, that was interesting. Not sure how it's gonna fit into the greater plot, but maybe it will, especially that evil presence that Alana senses. I mean, that probably, maybe, will be something. And then finally, the plotline that I found most interesting was Jaina and co. on Coruscant dealing with these restrictions that have been put in place and becoming aware that Seth Hallen is there. He's trying to break into the prison where Valen is being held for some reason, and they were like, oh boy, let's get him. And if the Galactic Alliance doesn't know we have him, we can study him and we can try to learn about the psychosis that's happening. We first saw Seth Hallen in Millennium Falcon, and I didn't really pay much attention to him because there wasn't any sense that he was suffering from this imposter delusion that Valen is. At that point, it seemed more like he was an out-of-control young Jedi, a la Kype Durin, and I was just like, okay, is that gonna be the plotline here? No. When he shows up here, he also thinks that everyone is imposters, except interestingly, he does not think Valen is an imposter, and that's why he's trying to break him out of prison. Interestingly enough, the delusion that people around you are imposters is like a real life condition. It's called Kagra. It's named after the French doctor who first observed it, although I don't think it's usually you think everyone's an imposter. You just think like your husband's an imposter or something like that. But that was interesting. And I think having this outbreak of madness among the Jedi, it really does not help the issues they're going through with the Galactic Alliance right now. And at the same time, Seagal doesn't know what's going on. She can't diagnose it. So they'll have to figure out, like, what's the cause and how do you heal them when it seems like they've just gone insane for no apparent reason. Jaina's observer is the little kid from the new Jedi Order series who looked like Anakin, who Vicky Sesh tried to use for a ploy, except now he's grown up, but he still looks like Anakin, and that freaks Jaina out, and that really freaked Tahiri Veila out. Tahiri has left the Jedi Order, so she's not a Jedi, but she's not a Sith. She's just sort of doing her own thing. But Jaina is reaching out to her. Jaina is trying to include her in this. And I wasn't wild about how in Invincible it seemed like Tahiri turned good really fast, so hopefully we'll see that play out more, and like what we see with Luke, the consequences of her actions happening here. Jaina's also just dating Jag. I guess they got back together after the end of Invincible, and I don't know, maybe they've been dating the whole time. It was a little bit like we're just thrown in. I'm like, oh, they're together again? Okay. I mean, maybe this is just me as like a person who reads a lot of historical novels, which usually have a romance subplot, but I'm like, I would have really liked to see them discussing things and like getting back together instead of throwing it in the, well, that happened in the 2-year time jump and now we're just them in a, established relationship. I always say that, but you're not gonna really get that in these books, and I should not be surprised. Jag is still the head of the Imperial Remnant. Now they're calling themselves the Empire again. He's still dealing with troublesome moffs. And he's also part of Jada's team to capture Seth and spirit him back to the Jedi Temple. And I thought this part was, a bit of fun because Jaina's like doing spy stuff. She's got a little team. They call themselves the Dark Meld. They even have Mirix Tarek involved. They don't want to tell her too much because she's obviously really upset about what happened with Valen. But I just love the scene where she shows up in a speeder and she'd like wrapped her face in foil. Things like that reminded me of the Race Squadron books, all the intelligence escapades that I got up to, which is maybe why that was my favorite part of the book. So I think my biggest issue with Outcast was just how very first book it felt, how there was just lots of setup, to get Luke and Ben to leave for their journey, but then also all the setup to show us how the relationship between the Galactic Alliance and the Jedi are bad. And so we've got to show a lot of that to get to that point. And the stuff with Valen helps to show that, how much they're not working together and in fact seem to be at opposite ends right now. And so maybe that first book syndrome is what contributed to me feeling meh about Luke and Ben's plotline and Han and Leia's on Kessel, where it just felt like, okay, well, this is stuff that we need to do, but I can't at this point see how it relates to the greater plot. And I was just more invested with the stuff on Coruscant involving, this delusional outbreak among 2 Jedi now and how that's affecting the political climate on the homeworld of the Galactic Alliance. My second issue, it's a little hard to explain, but we're supposed to feel really upset about these Jedi succumbing to madness, and the first one we see is Valenhorn. And I didn't feel as sad about Valen himself, but more that we know Corran, we know Mirax, we see how much this affects them and how upset they are. And so I was more worried about Valen's parents than worried about Valen himself, because Valen hasn't been a particularly prominent character up to this point. We saw him as like a little guy in the Bantam era very, very briefly. We saw him as like a preteen, young teen in New Jedi Order, and then we saw him like briefly in Legacy of the Force, but I don't know him like I know Jaina or even Tahiri. He's a little bit more of a void to me, so him succumbing to madness, you're like, that's sad, but it's more, that's so sad for his parents than that's sad for Valen himself. And then Seth is a completely new character to us. He just showed up briefly in Millennium Falcon, and now we're meant to be concerned like, oh man, he was such a great guy until this. Except it's like, well, I don't know Seth. I don't know him at all. And so maybe this is something they're holding in reserve for later books, but it almost seems like I would have picked slightly more prominent characters to succumb to madness so that it hits you as the reader harder. But again, I also don't really know where they're going with this, like what's the common thread going to be between them. So maybe they're all connected and maybe there's a reason why they can't be people we know well. But the fact that we don't know these guys super well means that I'm not as invested in their well-being as I would have been if, like, Jaina started running around yelling about how everyone had been replaced. And I don't want Jaina to be the one, I'm just saying. I care more about Jaina than Valen, sorry.
Hi there, Editor Meg coming to you live from Coruscant. My third issue in the original recorded form didn't make a lot of sense, so this is me trying to present it in a hopefully more understandable way. I feel that Fate of the Jedi really could have benefited from some time in between it and the previous series. Now, I can hear what you're saying, but Meg, there's 2 years in between Invincible and Outcast. And yes, it is true, there are 2 years in between them within the internal chronology of the books. But Invincible was published in 2008 and Outcast came out in 2009. So it was almost as the Legacy of the Force series was coming out, Del Rey was already planning for Fate of the Jedi, which I think explains why a lot of things are left so open-ended in that last book of the series. And we do have Millennium Falcon to fill the gap in between the two, although Millennium Falcon is obviously set much closer to Outcast than it is to Invincible. So I really think that the Fate of the Jedi series could have benefited from having more stories told in that gap. There was another novel planned. It was going to be called Blood Oath by Elaine Cunningham, and it was going to tell the story of what happened to Zek after Invincible, and also have a little bit dealing with Jagged Fell as the head of the Imperial Remnant. But due to stuff outside of her control, Cunningham just wasn't able to write the book at all, and it was canceled. There are 2 books about Jade and Core that are set after Invincible, but before Millennium Falcon, but they're definitely more like side adventures and don't really have anything to do with the main cast here. And so basically, I just feel like going from this galactic-wide civil war to a story that feels much lower stakes, I would have loved to see some stories in between the two, sort of like, bringing me down from that tension-filled high of Invincible to something much less huge and galaxy sweeping. And I think that maybe would have helped me adjust my expectations for Outcast, because at times I was like, this seems like really small stakes, and I'm sure that it will build from there. But just give me that story of Jaina and Jag getting back together and try to work it out. Give me a story about Tahiri Veila in the aftermath of Invincible. It seems like they jumped right from one 9-book series to another, and I really wish we could have gotten more standalones in between those.
So, in short, Outcast starts us off in the Fate of the Jedi series, and it seems like stakes are much lower than they were in the new Jedi Order series and Legacy of the Force. We don't have extragalactic invaders, we don't have a galaxy-wide civil war. Instead, we have escalating tensions between the Galactic Alliance and the Jedi, and how will that play out? But the book on the whole did feel full of setup to me, like, we've got to get through this novel and then we'll start digging into the stuff. But it's really like setting the place, setting the tone, getting Luke and Ben off on that journey, even if they don't really learn a lot on their first stop along the way, sending Han and Leia off to do something that I'm not sure will have relevance for the rest of the story. It felt a little pointless here, but I'd be happy to be wrong. So next time I'm going to be reading the second book in the Fate of the Jedi series, Omen by Christie Golden.